the main event this afternoon is our distinguished guest speaker, Rick van Gijn, who talks about towards construction-based areal typology, 3 case studies of the Upper Amazon. Rick is a professor at the University of Leiden. He's a professor, and I have to read that out because it's a long title.
I don't know it myself.
He is a professor of ethno-linguistic vitality and diversity in the world. And that it's a very prestigious professorship, actually. I was very excited to learn about that. I'm very excited that Rick became that professor. It's a professorship which is sponsored by CIPL. CIPL is the Comité International Permanent de Linguistes. It's a global organization to promote linguistics, and they have this professorship which they endow because they think it's important that people working precisely on linguistic diversity. And the previous chair was Felix Ameika in Leiden, who is an Africanist. And we were saying earlier, it's really nice to see also now that the geographic focus shifted from Africa to South America, to the Amazon. So this is where Rick's work is based. So Rick has worked quite extensively on language documentation. He had a number of research grants looking at language variation, historical linguistics, structural linguistics, morphology, syntax, also quite a bit work on phylogenetic methods and modern corpus-based methods. The area itself, I'm not very familiar with it, but from the abstract that Rick sent, it's really interesting because it's one of the areas of the world which is very complex, very linguistic diverse, and where there seems to be mismatches between genetic affiliation, language families or subgrouping, and structural diversity. And that's something, we had a number of talks. We had a talk by Caius Sinemaki a few months ago, which sits in the similar space. So it's a really exciting field of linguistics emerging at the moment. So we are really excited to listen to you today. And yeah, we are looking forward to the talk. Thank you, Rick, for coming.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Lutz. And also thank you to the Royal Philological Society for this invitation. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you, Dunstan, as well, and Chasti, for arranging everything. I'm very happy to be here. What I want to talk about today is indeed something that I've been working on for a while. It comes sort of from a slight dissatisfaction in typology and in areal typology that I had. I'm not sure that I entirely solved this, but what I want to present is at least a step towards, I think, what might be a solution, at least to my qualms with typology. And that is sort of marrying typology with parts of the insights that come from construction grammar. And then try to do still quite large-scale comparisons. So, oh, this doesn't work. Oops. Yeah. So if you know the World Atlas of Language Structures typological database, this is a typical chapter from that, where they track the existence or the absence of inflectional future marking, which is all very fine, but it has its limitations as well, especially in sort of thinking about what typology is becoming slowly. Namely, it is no longer really only about possible languages and probable languages, but it's also, as Balthasar Bickel put it, what is where, why. So typology is also slowly becoming an approach to language change and historical linguistics. And then I think you run into some trouble here. So if you have a language that has inflectional future and it has a red dot here, then it tells you nothing about the semantic range of these markers. What else can they mark besides future tense, for instance? It doesn't tell you anything about formal marking patterns. Are these suffixes, prefixes, free elements? Depending on your definition of inflectionality, of inflection, it might not tell you anything about obligatoriness of these markers either. And you will have to come up with some kind of a definition of inflection that can be applied across languages, which is not easy. Similarly, in proposals for linguistic areas, you get these lists of features that the languages share, And it's more or less the same problem. So here, this is an example of a proposed linguistic area in the Bolivia-Brazil border area, the Guapo de Mamoré. Millie Krevel and Hein van der Voort listed a number of features, one of them being subordination through nominalization. And I've taken two languages from that area and two normalizations. So the top one is Apurina, an Arawakan language, and the bold printed element there is a normalization that can combine with no verbal inflection. And it marks the complement of the verb to want. Here, this bottom one is Yuracare, which is quite different. It's also a normalization, also a subordinate or a subordination strategy, but it allows for verbal object marking, future marking, or tense marking for verbal subject marking, and it also carries a case marker. And so these are very different from each other, but they both count as instances of subordination through nominalization. So it tells you nothing about the degree of normalization. So what nominal characteristics do these things have? What verbal characteristics can they still have? And what semantics do they cover? So you compare quite different things to each other. That's the risk here. One last example, maybe that doesn't come from me. This Martin Haspelmath in 2001 talks about the average standard European. And he lists 12 features, and one of them is the presence of a definite, indefinite distinction in the article system. And this is something that Thomas Stolz looked into in more detail. And his point is, yes, we can say that. And if that's your definition, then you get the big area, that is then the area, but you can also look in more detail in these constructions. And then you see, for instance, you have cases like German, where there's a definite and an indefinite article, but then you get, for instance, Swedish, where you have a suffixed definite article and an indefinite article preposed to the word, and so on to the list, up to Georgian, where you have only a determiner for definite and not for indefinite. These are all grouped together as being examples of this indefinite-definite distinction. And you see that if you, depending on what you choose, you draw different lines within that area. So it might lead to very different results if you do it differently. So that is typology. And on the other hand, the construction grammar is an approach to language that has come up in the last decades, particularly. And it is although sympathetic, I would say, to functional linguistics and typology, is quite different as well. So the unit of observation is construction, and I'll just read this from Friday Nikiforidou. Speakers' grammatical knowledge that's observed in actual language use is gathered in complex multidimensional units, constructions, in which form, whether syntactic, morphological, phonic, gestural, or a combination of any of these, is indivisible from its meaning or usage function. So in other words, languages consists, in their view, of units of form and meaning of different sizes and guises. So it could be a morpheme, it could be a sentence, it could be a complex sentence, but this form meaning thing comes back. I wouldn't say that I, in my approach here, follow construction grammar entirely, because for that, I think it's too difficult to combine typology and construction grammar on a larger scale. But what I do want to, especially in this talk, want to borrow from construction grammar is the insight that Mithune gives in the same volume as the previous quote, where she says that in context situation, we see the replication of constructions of all lengths and degrees of abstraction, as well as all, most, or just some constructional features. So the idea here is that all of these dimensions of a construction are subject potentially to borrowing. So you can either borrow a form, and with it, it's semantics, or only the form and different semantics, or only the semantics, not the form. All these constellations are possible. And that requires, I think, a slightly different approach to doing typology, if you, especially areal typology, if you want to sort of prove contact effects. So how do I approach it? And this is something that I will happily discuss afterwards as well, because I'm definitely not saying that this is the way to go and there's no other way. Certainly discussion is possible here, but this is what I do. So the units of observation in traditional typology being languages as a whole, and then you keep track of whether they have features or not. In my approach, the unit of observation becomes a construction. So one language consists of several constructions, and those constructions can be compared to other constructions in other languages. And what are constructions then in this approach? And this is probably where I deviate a little bit from construction grammar. These are abstract schemata where we code for different variables that make up a construction. As of yet, I haven't found a way to include language use, which is very important in construction grammar variables, because what I do is based on reference grammars, and so you need to be able to find that information in reference grammars, and this goes a step too far in my experience, at least. So and I don't keep track. I could have done it, but I didn't, of phonetic form. So if you have a morpheme, I only keep track of characteristics of particular constructions, but not the form itself. That might be the next step that I could do, which is actually easy to combine with this approach to typology. So in those senses, I just wanted to say the approach that I take here is sort of a compromise between traditional large-scale typology on the one hand and construction grammar on the other. So then what does it look like physically, as it were? We have big spreadsheets where a language is basically a sheet in an Excel file consisting of a number of constructions. And those constructions are tied together by the fact that they express a similar area of grammar. So what I will be talking about today is tense, aspect, modality, mood, and evidentiality. That's one area of grammar that we've carved out. And then languages can have between one and many constructions that express differences in tense, aspect, mood, and evidentiality. You see here then that this is one language, and a language then becomes an inventory, as it were, of constructions, where one construction is coded by different features of the construction. I will explain more concretely what that means for TAME, so tense, aspect, modality, and evidentiality. And then you get these profiles of constructions that you can compare to each other. What I usually do is, and this is also akin to construction grammar, I have a bunch of features that define the form in a construction, formal aspects, and then a bunch of features that define more meaning or function-related aspects. Then how does it work if you want to do a cross-linguistic comparison? So this is the traditional approach in typology. You get a language 1, this should be language 2 actually. Language 1, and you compare to language 2. Language 1 has a feature, say, let's say normalization as a subordination strategy, yes or no, and here yes or no, and so on, and you directly compare the features to each other. What we do is we have construction 1 in language 1, and we compare to construction 1 in language 2, and here we have construction 2 in language 1 and construction 2 in language 2. And so all of these features are compared to each other on the construction level. So this construction is compared to this one and to this one, and this construction to this one and to this one. And then you can, in the next step, you can calculate distances between those constructions. So how similar are they, or how different are they in terms of overlapping features? Then what I do, because we do want to get back to the language level, because that's often easier to talk about, we aggregate, as it were. So from that sort of very dispersed signal, we come back to a language, and we can do it in two ways, which I will show in this talk as well. One is we can define some predefined groups. For instance, you might want to compare two language families to each other. So you define all the constructions that are from the languages in one language family as one group, and all the constructions in the languages from another family as another group. And then you test whether they are significantly different from each other or not. And that can lead you to finding contact effects, for instance. Another one is to measure the shortest distance. This is something that we developed because what you sometimes get if you have a detailed approach like this is that you get one signal that points one way, another signal that points the other way, and they cancel each other out. So this is an approach where we try to maximize the commonalities between languages. So rather than comparing each construction to each other construction, we allow languages to, in their first construction, to look for the closest match in another language in terms of the constructions. And that is the comparison. I have actually schematized it here. So what you would get then is a language one with three constructions and a language two with three constructions. Construction one is closest to construction one in language two, but construction two is also closest to construction one. So the most similarities, and construction three as well. So in the comparison, all of these three constructions are actually compared to construction one and not to the other one. So these are ignored then. And from the perspective of language two, construction one might be compared to construction one, and construction two to three, and three to two, because those are the shortest distances. And that way you get sharper signals, as it were, of both contact and genealogy, but at least of commonalities between languages. So this is a way to cancel out conflicting signals. Okay, so the area of grammar that I want to talk about is tense aspect, mood modality and evidentiality. I will use the term tame from now on, because otherwise I will keep tripping over my own words. So what we do is then we look at form variables and meaning variables. And the form variables that we look at are, on the one hand, prosodic dependence and orientation. So if you're a suffix or an enclitic, then you will have a leftward prosodic orientation in our approach. If you're a prefix or a proclitic, you have a rightward orientation. If you're an infix or an endoclitic, you have what we then call an ambidirectional one, but you're inside then. And you could also have independent, so prosodic independence. The next one is morphological technique, where we broadly distinguish between linear and nonlinear morphology, and within nonlinear between segmental, nonlinear, so vowel changes, consonant changes, suprasegmental, tone, for instance, and reduplication would be the third. And then another one is what host does it, if it's a morphology, because we're mainly talking about morphology here in this case of tame, does it attach to a nominal host, a verbal host, or some other lexical class? And then we also distinguish between whether it attaches to a word or a phrase, or both are possible. So those are the form variables. And then we also keep track of whether there is flexivity, allomorphy, and also the number of syntagmatic pieces. So that if you have, for instance, a circumfix, you can have both leftward and rightward prosodic orientation. But then here you say there are two syntagmatic pieces making it up. Yeah. And then in terms of meaning or function, aspect, we have a binary coding system for perspective. So this is mainly about the perfective, imperfective distinction, whether you're outside the event looking at it, or inside the event looking at it. And And then we have something we call phasal focus. So whether you focus on the initial phase of the event or a final phase, and if you're outside the event, so if you have a completive, for instance, you're there, and if you have a sort of an imminent aspect or anticipatory aspect, you're on the other side. And then we also keep track of multiplicity. So is there internal structure? Is it for instance, to distinguish progressives from repetitives? And phasal stance is another area that we look at, where we distinguish between still and already as types, and then the negative counterparts of those as well. So we do look at grammaticalized elements, although that's not always easy to distinguish, but so we end up with a lot of morphology in the end in this particular database. And then so this would be one part of the semantic of the meaning variables for aspect. Tense is maybe a little bit less developed. So we code time with respect to speech event, so only absolute tense, and remoteness distinctions, where we distinguish between three levels, close, medial, and remote. But we allow also for languages to group some of these, where we basically follow a line of thinking that if something really is about the same day, then it will be classified as close. If it includes yesterday, then it will include medial. And if it includes, say, weeks or months before that or years, then it will be coded as remote. So we distinguish then between past, future, and present. And then for past and future, we also distinguish between three remoteness distinctions. And modality, this is basically, and here I would be interested in input in what else we could put in for modality. What we have now is whether a construction expresses permission, obligation, commission, so that you say, I will do it. Ability and willingness is basically for desiderative and those kinds of elements. Then evidentiality and epistemic modality, we distinguish between speculation, inference, assumption, reportative, visual, direct, non-visual, and parallel world is something that we use for hypotheticals and arealis markers. So something that is not about this real world, but something more imaginable. And then emotive stance is something that we have started to keep track of, because we noticed that in these South American languages, lots of morphemes express something like surprise or sadness or apprehension, those kinds of things. So we thought it was interesting to keep track of those as well. Right, so that is basically the scheme for how the database looks. So one construction would have all of these variables in a line, and then all of these variables would be the same for every construction, but of obviously different values, so that you can calculate distances between them. So the distances that we calculate, mostly here is a Gowers distance. So it's the simplest measure, where you basically say for each parallel feature, is it the same or not? And then for each one that's the same, you get one point towards similarity, and if it's different, 1 point towards dissimilarity. Okay, so that is the linguistic background, and this is the geographical background. So what I'm looking at is the upper Amazon, which is basically the westernmost fringe of the Amazon that ends in the slopes towards the Andes. This is an interesting area for several reasons. One is that it's in between many different sort of ancient power blocks, as according to archaeologists, often as a connecting area. But also from a diversity point of view, it's an interesting area, because you have what you could call a microcosm of diversity patterns. Because here in the north, you have a multicultural, multilingual contact sphere with, there's two families that are pretty dominantly present there. That's the Tucanoan family and the Arawakan family. They have often, but not always, there's different rules, but often they have institutionalized exogamy. So you have to marry outside your group. Sometimes that is within your own language family, but in some cases also Arawakans have to marry Tucano people and vice versa. And there's also some presence of Quechuan, but I think that's a little bit more to the periphery, geographically speaking. Then in the middle, you have something, oh, and in the north, there are also tons of very small language families and isolates, some isolates as well, in the background. And the idea there is that the small language families and isolates were the first layer, and then the expansions took place of Quechuan and Tucanoan and Arawakan, which then left us with sort of a mix of leftovers of the previous diversity pattern and the expansions of the language families, which come at the cost of the diversity, obviously. In the center, this process might have been, it has developed further, you might say, because I'm sure that there was lots of family diversity there as well. Small language families and isolates, but not anymore. Now there are three larger language families that dominate the area. One is Quechuan, which is on the Andean side. And then on the most Amazonian side, there's the Panoans, and in between are the Arawakans. And they have very likely supplanted a much richer scene. And what is also important here is that archaeologists have found that this has been a trade network for a long time from the Andes into the Amazon. This comes back in the story about this particular case study in the center. In the south, you have arguably the most remaining diversity when it comes to language families. Many language isolates and many small language families. There are also some representatives of larger families like Arawakan and Tupian. But this is a very diverse area. It's also been proposed, we saw it earlier on, that this is a Sprachbund. This was the proposal by Krevels and Van der Voort. And that there has been contact between the Andes and the Amazon for a long time, just not in the most recent of times. Probably since the Inca arrival, it went back, but before that was likely a lot of trade between different heights. Okay, I think that covers the backgrounds in linguistics approach and in geography. And what I want to do now is just present maybe a little bit of a showcase of the kind of questions that you could try to answer with this approach on the basis of three case studies, which refer to the north, the center, and the south that I just talked about. I start in the south and then I work my way up to the north. So remember, the south is a very diverse area, lots of small language families and isolates. And I also mentioned already that there has been this contact between the highland and lowland in Bolivia. So this is something I wanted to focus on here, where I will try to find linguistic results of this contact between highland and lowlands in Bolivia. So what we know from the ethnohistorical and linguistic and archaeological literature is that contact and trade between the highlands and lowlands was very common. Like I said, it reduced when the Incas came to the Altiplano, and it reduced further, I think, when the Europeans arrived. And this has sort of given the impression, based on the current situation, that the Andes and the Amazon are very different worlds, and they don't interconnect. But I think historically that's wrong. And I think we also see the results of that in the linguistics, actually. Another thing is that from the ethnohistorical literature, we know that there was a very complex array of ethnonyms, partly of people that we don't really know who they represent. So it was much richer before. Sometimes groups still exist, but they have changed names, and sometimes groups have disappeared without a trace. So it was even more complex than it is now. When the Incas arrived, they did do trade with the lowlands, but it seems that there's little archaeological evidence that they went beyond. So the Beni River is sort of the northwest of Bolivia. There they came down, but not much further than that. So the Llanos de Mojos is an area in the Amazon, which is also a big cultural center. There seems to be no evidence of Inca presence there, of highland presence there. We do, however, see in linguistics, in lexicon, we see results of language contact between highland and lowland languages, but this especially then is the pre-Inca area. There are related to that areal typological continuities between the highlands and the lowlands, so there's certainly not a clear boundary between them when you look at the linguistics. There's a proposed sprachgut in the lowlands, so this is the Guapore Mamre, but also in the highlands. This is the Central Andean sprachgut. And then there's unclear dynamics, partly because of these difficult situation with the ethnonyms, but also because we just don't have access to the information. So we don't know in this trade between highland and lowland what group played what role. So hopefully linguistics can shed a bit of light on this. So what I did here is I took a subsample of 19 languages of several affiliation, but I divided them into two groups. So this is these two predefined groups that you can have. So it doesn't necessarily have to be families. It can be these areal distinctions based on location and also of known history that we know that these languages have been in the lowlands or the highlands for a long time. And so here on the map, you see, I don't know how familiar you are with South America, but this is Bolivia. These are the Andes here, and these are the lowlands. So you see a clear division between those languages. So when looking at constructions, I'm showing this, but this doesn't tell us a whole lot. This is basically the visualization of the distances between all the constructions in the database for these 19 languages. And the only thing you can see here is that blue is Andean construction, red is Amazonian, that they have a widespread and they have some overlap, but also some areas like on the top there, where you mainly have Amazonian constructions and not Andean constructions. What I put more faith in is this Permanova test. So what you can do is you can compare the spread and the centroids of these distributions of constructions, and then a Permanova test tests whether they are significantly different from each other or not, these groups. And in this case, they're certainly different from each other. So one thing that we can do as a next step is to go over to this shortest distance measure that we call a matching constructions index, to see whether if we sort of highlight the similarities between the languages, whether some more substructure comes along. Yeah, so on this measure, there's no evidence of linguistic influence between highland and lowland. So if we use what I will call the MCI from now on, you see that the distinction no longer is significant. So this measure makes them closer to each other. I do think that you see a little bit of substructure here so now each of these labels here is a language, and it's a glottocode. But this, for instance, is Movima, which is a lowland language, and then all the way up north you have Pukina, which is a highland language, for instance. So what I will highlight here is first this one here. This is a seemingly, well, sort of maybe a bit of a cluster here, where you have two Aymaran languages, the blue ones, two Arawakan languages, Trinitario and Ignaciano. You would expect them to end up close to each other because they are related to each other. But then the Arawakan and Aymaran languages are not related to each other at all. In fact, people have said that they have had very little contact with each other, or some people have. And there's another language there that you can hardly see, which is Chiquitano, which is further to the east, which was also part of a sort of an important cultural sphere. And so the languages are highlighted here in blue. They're a bit far from each other, but the interesting thing here is that you have the Altiplano, which has been sort of the source of complex societies, influential societies, not just Inca, but also before that there were societies there. notably something called Tiwanaku. There's still a very interesting archaeological site in Bolivia that I've never been to, but I really want to go. Then there's the Llanos de Mojos, where the Arawakan groups are. This is also something where they have discovered very complex structures and dense populations with LiDAR research. And then the Chiquitania, we know not very much about, but it's very likely that it was an important cultural sphere before the arrival of the Europeans, certainly after. So this is something where the Jesuits played a big role and the local language, Chiquitano, they used it as a lingua franca, and that made many languages incorporate into that as well. So one area in time where we can put this maybe is at the time of Tiwanaku, but because we know that that is a time where there was probably contact between Arawakan and Andean groups, and that is between 400 and 1200 CE. But also, I think later stages are important, like the Jesuit stage. So what characterizes these languages? In themselves, they seem not necessarily very exotic things. So these languages tend to have a continuative versus perfective distinction, an already versus still grammaticalized distinction, future tense, desiderative, reportative, recent past. Not all of languages have that, but some of the languages. And they are mostly verbal suffixes as well, so on the formal side. And you get these, sometimes you get these quite clear parallel structures, like in Aymara and Trinitario here, where there's a suffix which means gradually becoming something, which is a suffix that I haven't seen a lot in South America, but these two languages, unrelated to each other, have them. So how can we interpret this historically? Well, we know that there was an old trade route connecting the Llanos de Mojos and the Chiquitania, so that is this connection here. That later on with the Incas, it was also used to pass on artifacts from the Andes to the Amazon. Then we know that Arawakan elements are present in the highland culture of Tiwanaku. And later on in the 17th and 18th century, Chiquitano, as I said, was used as a lingua franca in the Jesuit times. And many groups that spoke a different language switched to Chiquitano. And among these languages were Arawakan languages. So this is another way that Arawakan elements may have crept into Chiquitano as well. Yes, one thing that I need to say about this group here is that it's a bit of a surprise that Puquina is not part of that group, because people have suggested that Puquina was actually the language spoken in Tiwanaku, although other people say it was Aymaran. So from these results, it would appear that Aymaran would be a better candidate, but we simply don't know. There are other arguments to think it's Puquina. One reason that Puquina is so far off might be that it is an extinct language, and we have a very limited database that we can work with. So many of these features for Puquina are a bit contentious. Another group that's interesting here is what I call the Andes foothill network. And this is something that has been recorded in linguistics and a little bit in ethnohistory as well. That we know that there was pre-Inca contact. So Incas starts in the 13th century, more or less. So pre-Inca contact between local Andean languages and foothill languages. And those are exactly what you see here. But also with Quechua here, which was the language of the Incas. So it seems also to be two layers, one of pre-Inca contact between highland and lowland, and then the incursion of the Incas with Quechua as well. And from the Incas, we know that they had contact with the Tacanan group, which are the three red dots in the north over there, which not just Quechua, also Aymara, by the way, but Quechua appears closer here. So what characterizes this group? It's a bit of a bigger list, but they have reportatives, markers for epistemic certainty and uncertainty, apprehensives, hypothetical or an epistemic possibility, desiderative, future, also perfective, continuative opposition, inchoative markers, repetitive and distributive markers, anticipatory aspect markers. I've highlighted this because the examples are about the anticipatory aspect. And again, these are mostly suffixes or enclitics. So here you see three examples of three languages in that network. Moseten, which is a foothill Amazonian language, where the suffix JJ means combined with leave. He was about to leave. In Chipaya, you have ata, I'm about to eat. And in Yuracare, you have what I call the anticipatory aspect. He is or was about to arrive. And this is also something that I highlighted because this is also not a common aspectual distinction that languages at least in South America make. But these three languages that are in this network do. Okay, how can we interpret this historically? Willem Adelaar has proposed three successive stages in the contact between highlands and lowlands, and we can add a fourth to that. So the first one is that there was, pre-Inca times, there was a balanced interaction between Uru Chipaya, which are Andean languages, and foothill groups in the lower reaches, where we can actually see lexical influence between these languages, but also in this network we see, in Tame at least, we see grammatical influence as well. Then in the era of Tiwanaku, we know that there are cultural elements from the Amazon, from Arawak, in the Tiwanaku culture. There was a connection between the Llanos de Mojos and the Andes, and between the Llanos de Mojos and the Chiquitania. So there was this, that's the first network that I talked about. Then with the Incas, there's an incursion of Quechua-speaking groups in the Altiplano, and the contact with the lowlands becomes a bit different. So first of all, it becomes less, and it becomes unidirectional. So it's really influence from the Andes onto the Amazonian languages and not vice versa anymore. And then a fourth phase that we could add is the use of Chiquitano as a lingua franca, incorporating many different groups. So this is people being put in reductions by the Jesuits, often reducing strongly in population numbers, so that you get small groups speaking different languages, living in the same settlements, and that has effects on the languages, obviously. Okay, so this is just to show you that these constructions and the distance measures can give you some hypotheses about, or maybe some ways to connect your results to historical literature that I think are quite interesting. The central upper Amazon is a slightly different story. So you have these three families, Quechuan, Arawakan, and Panoan. Quechuan has a large spread, but the main spread has come about with the spread of the Inca Empire, which is only between 13th and 16th century. But the core of the family around Lima, basically, is older. We know this because of the diversity that exists between those variants. And Adler has estimated about 2,000 years for that language family. Arawakan is also a much bigger language family, so they were also present in the south, and they will also come back in the north. And they're actually all over Brazil as well, or were at least. And they came into this particular valley. We don't know exactly, but it might also be 2,000 years. So this is what is being proposed by Lev Michael and colleagues. And the Panoan language family probably originates in the area, and we don't know exactly, but estimates vary between 1,000 and 3,000 years, and probably more towards the 1,000 than the 3,000 years. There's a proposal for a deeper Pano-Takanan family, which is then older, obviously, than those 2,000 years. But the Takanan family figured just in the other case study in Bolivia. So what's interesting here is that there's archaeological evidence for a trade route that has been in existence for a very long time, used by successive populations that lived in the area. among those populations, the groups that I will be talking about, but also before that, other groups. In the sort of the most modern incursion with the Arawakans and the Panoans, it is usually thought of as the Arawakans coming in with their canoes because they were river people, and then changing the way of life of the Panoans, which were interfluvial people, and some of them became riverine people as well. There's also some evidence in linguistics and in culture of influence between Pano and Arawakans. But they sort of entered a pre-existing network that was probably in existence since about 1,000 to 300 years before the Common Era. Yes, so this is the cultural influence that I talked about, the change of the interfluvial to riverine of the Panoans, some of the Panoans, cultural influence in certain cultural practices of groups. So Piro or Yine is also what they're called. They are an Arawakan group, but culturally they look a little bit like Panoans, you might say. And also there's well-documented cultural influence of Quechua in Yanesha. Yanesha is the Arawakan language that is spoken the highest, the closest to the Andes, so to speak. There's lexical borrowing in Ashaninka, which is an Arawakan language that has borrowed stuff to Panoan languages. Quechua, Shipibo Konibo has words from Quechua. Shipibo is a Panoan language as well. Yanesha, the Arawakan language, has many words from Quechua. And also, it seems, a couple of words from Panoan. People have proposed structural borrowing, so the development of a reported, non-reported system in Arawakan and Panoan languages who don't have it in their proto-languages. A possible spread of certain valency changing categories and a limited grammatical influence of Quechuan on Yanesha. And there's also evidence for family internal cross-language context. So in other words, there seems to be plenty of evidence of people moving around, having contact with other people, both within and outside their family group. And this led Alf Hornborg and Luwe Eriksen to the conclusion that they think that there was a system here in central upper Amazon where the Quechua-speaking groups in the highlands had contact with the Panoans in the lowlands through the mediation of the intermediate Arawakans. And so they go as far as to say that they are sure that genetically speaking, so DNA speaking, the Panoans and the Arawakans should look exactly the same. Well, this is something that I can tell that's not true. So we've collected genetic data in the area and they don't look the same at all, actually. So I think they were wrong about that particular claim. But we can look from the linguistic side whether we see evidence of this chain of contact. And here I've taken 29 languages from this area, from the 3-language family, and then the predefined groups here are the language families. So Arawakan, Panoan, and Quechua. Again, if we look at the construction level, these are completely different systems. So no signs of convergence between Pano, Arawak, and Quechua. But if we zoom in on the matching constructions index, so we highlight the similarities between them, then we see that the difference between Arawak and Pano disappears. It's no longer significant, as it were. So we see some similarity effects there. And if we look at this particular graph here, we see that some languages are closer to each other and some languages are a bit more outside. Partially, although not entirely, this corresponds to geographical locations. In particular, for those two here, Panoan languages, Matis and Matses, they are spoken closer to Brazil, in Brazil, closer to Colombia. So they're far removed from this exchange network. To some extent, also Yayos Quechua, which is more towards the coastal side. Amawakan and Kapanawa are still interfluvial people who maybe didn't interact so much with this trade work as the other people. So there's you can see some elements of history here already. But what I wanted to do here, just to show you that this is also a possibility that you can do, is we have these different areas. As I showed you, we have evidentiality, epistemic modality, aspect, event modality, and tense. And here you can see that if you separate those, then you get different signals. So even here you can get conflict signals, where from the perspective of the chain between Quechuans, Arahuacans, and Panoans, the evidentiality epistemic modality is the most interesting one, because there we see no significant difference between Arahuacans and both other groups. So this would correspond to this intermediate position that they would have. So I won't go into all of them, but I will go into the evidentiality epistemic modality here. And if you then plot that, you see that it is, so the overall diversity is quite small, because it goes from minus 0.01 to plus 0.01. So to some extent, all these languages look alike, you could say. But you do see some Panoan languages being like Quechuan languages, some Arahuacan languages being like Panoan languages, or the other way around. So there's no real clear pattern in that sense. And one thing that we know is that, because based on this, I dove into the data, and we also know it from the literature, that some Panoan and Arahuacan languages have developed a system which is sort of a minimal evidential system of reportative versus non-reportative. So they only have a reportative marker. And also an epistemic system with a dubitative certainty distinction. And especially the evidential ones are interesting. Quechuan languages have a more elaborate system of evidentiality coupled with epistemic modality. But I should sort of move on a little bit. But what we also see is that there's more variation in form in the Panoan languages. So there are more free and mobile elements in the Panoan languages. So this sort of points to a sort of later grammaticalization process than the other languages. So what we can do here, for instance, is we can weigh down the formal aspects to see whether the Panoan languages become a bit closer to Quechuan. And if we do that, so I've halved the weights for the formal parameters, and then all the significance is gone between all of the groups. How to interpret this? So we know from other studies that neither Panoan and Arahuacan had evidential systems in their proto-languages, so they developed it. So a logical conclusion would be with that Quechuan, which has proto-system of evidentiality, was the source for both of these other language families. And maybe indeed it was passed on from Arahuacan to Panoan. So Quechua, the original system, then to Arahuacan and to Panoan. Although we don't see any formal borrowing. And then the formal diversity, so the fact that there are more clitics and more free elements in Panoan might point to the fact that they are a younger system. And that possibly Arahuacans did play an intermediate role, but I'm aware that many other conclusions are possible here. So this definitely needs more research. I think I will, in the interest of time, I will skip the third case study, which is more about two languages that you can compare and then go actually in depth of which constructions they share particularly. But I'll skip to the conclusions. Oh, sorry. Here. So what I wanted to show you here is that this approach based on constructional profiles and maybe even more so distance measuring here can generate or test hypotheses of several different kinds. So in the first case study, we saw a detection of possible past networks that can be connected to the ethnohistorical and archaeological literature. In the second test of two ethnohistorians, in this case, of a network and how it worked, and disentangling potentially conflicting signals. The one that I didn't talk about is the detection of semi-unique shared traits between, or shared constructions, I should say, between pairs of languages. And I just want to stress that I see this as an explorative tool, mostly, and it definitely has to be combined with with historical data, with archaeological data, with genetic data wherever possible. So by itself, I think it's a little bit too shaky, but combined with those elements, it becomes, I think, potentially interesting and powerful tool. I just wanted to say that this was part of a project that took place between 2019 and 2025. All of these people played a role in the one is here, actually. And I want to thank everybody who worked on this. I had a very pleasant time with all of these people. And we did some nice work, I think. And with that, I wanted to thank you, the European Research Council, CIPL, and of course the entire SFR team. So thank you very much.